Hi, this is Drew Jones of Drew's Guitar Shop, and today I wanted to show off this Regal. Wait, come back. Not that kind of Regal. I'm not talking about like one of the new Regal branded guitars that are like made in China, terrible frets, terrible setup, terrible action. Um, what I'm talking about actually is this, which is a Regal by Fender. This is a classical guitar. I haven't dated this one yet, but I'm gonna guess that it's probably from the mid '70s at least. And it's actually a really nice guitar. I really like it. It's got an excellent build quality. It's got excellent tone. Um, and yeah, I think that it's a really solid guitar. Certainly blows the other Regals that I was talking about a little earlier out of the water in terms of tone. Now, I might be retuning this guitar kind of periodically throughout the video. This guitar literally just came off the bench, and so the strings that I just put on it are still kind of stretching out. Classical guitars, incidentally, have kind of a maturity curve, a break-in period with their strings. I used to like to call this the 2 weeks of hell back when I was playing on D'Addario strings, and it's been kind of shortened to like the few days of hell because I've switched over to Savarez red cards, which stretch out a little bit less. Or at least they get all the stretch out of them a little earlier than the D'Addarios did. The D'Addarios are perfectly fine strings, though I do think that the Savarez red cards are better. Personally, it's a matter of taste when it comes to strings oftentimes. So anyway, getting on to this guitar, things that were done to it. I don't sell guitars in their stock condition here generally. Generally, I do a lot of work on these instruments to really get them playing as well as they possibly can, and check them out for any problems and fix anything that needed fixing. The guitars that I sell here are vintage guitars without vintage guitar headaches, and so what I like to do is I like to take the mystery and the kind of gamble out of going out and buying vintage guitars. Being somebody who buys a lot of vintage guitars and does a lot of work on them and has spent basically 20 years learning what to look for in terms of problems, I will tell you that it is a gamble. When you go out and you buy a vintage guitar, a lot of times there's stuff wrong with them. And so, same thing for customers that come in here. I can't tell you how many people I've gotten in here who've gotten something off of Reverb or eBay or wherever, and thought they were getting a good deal, and they bring it into the shop. I take a look at it, and I have to go, well, yeah, but... and sometimes the but is to the tune of hundreds and hundreds of dollars because it needs a lot of work in very expensive areas. So that's the kind of thing that I like to avoid giving to customers of mine. So let's talk about all of the upgrades and improvements and things that have been done to this guitar to bring it up to where I'm happy with it, and I'm happy enough to sell it. So the first thing that I generally do is I replace the nut. Older guitars especially, if they have a plastic nut on them, and oftentimes they do, that plastic has had many decades to sit and shrink and turn chalky and get really weird in ways that are really unhappy for such a critical part of the guitar, because the nut affects a lot of things. I see a lot of talk on forums about the tone that comes from a bone nut. Yeah, there's some tonal benefits, but more what I would be concerned about with a nut would be whether or not that material that the nut is made out of is grabbing onto the strings and not letting them move through those nut slots, which can cause tuning problems, which affect the performance of the instrument directly. That's a thing that you can see. You can see that on a tuner. If you take a guitar and you put it in front of a tuner and you play that string and you tune it, and you're looking at the needle move. If you're tuning up here and you're not seeing any corresponding movement from that needle, it means that you're either tightening or loosening just this space here on the string between the tuner and the nut. And that eventually is going to be let go by that nut that is pinching it, and it is going to either go really flat or really sharp. And so that's a bad thing. The nuts that I carve here are specifically carved to be low friction, in that the way that I shape the slots, which is kind of a parabolic curve, avoids any kind of sharp corners that the string can hang up on, which is one of the ways that you end up with those friction points with a nut. So generally speaking, a straight nut slot all the way through, just in a straight line. I used to way back in the day carve them that way, and the reason that I do what I do now is because I realized that there were issues with that. You definitely want that nut slot to kind of guide that string kind of gently towards wherever it's going, and avoid any sharp corners. So that's one thing. Another thing is that I actually get inside that nut slot and I polish the hell out of it. I get in there with some really fine grit sandpaper and I smooth it out, and then I actually take it to a buffing wheel and I polish it. So by the time I'm done, if you look inside each one of those little slots, there's this little mirror shine that's in there that string is sitting on, and on top of that I add lubrication and other stuff that really makes it a slick surface. And so this nut has really low friction on these strings. So when you go to tune, the guitar tunes. There are some tonal benefits. There's some overtones and some other things that come from this side of the guitar that do go back into the body and produce a great tone, and that is a benefit as well. Another really good benefit is that bone is a very hard material, whereas plastic nuts tend to wear down, especially on steel string guitars. Bone tends to be a very solid surface for a very long time, and so the work that has been done here is likely not to need repeating for quite some time. So moving on, the next part that I usually will replace with bone is the saddle. Now the saddle has much more of an impact on an acoustic guitar in terms of tone. I would say that if I had to give it a number, it'd be somewhere in like 15 to 20% more volume, tone, just everything. Plastic is one of the worst materials, in my opinion, to use here. There are plastics that are better than others. I really like the Graphtec New Bone and Tusk, and especially if you're trying to avoid animal cruelty, those are good ways to go. But bone really is kind of the sound. That's what you imagine in your head when you hear an acoustic guitar in your head is that frequency that you get from a bone saddle. And the reason for that is just because plastic is a softer material. It tends to rob frequencies from the energy that's going into the top as they travel through that. Everything that most of the sound that you're hearing has to go through these strings, through this saddle, through the bridge, and then into the top of the guitar, into the braces. And so if it's not a good conductor of energy that you have there, you've basically got kind of a bottleneck. And so if you have a piece of plastic there, that piece of plastic is going to tend to resonate more with low frequencies and tend not to resonate very well with high frequencies, and so you end up with what ends up amounting to kind of a low-pass filter. So like if you had a low-pass filter, would be like the tone knob on most electric guitars where you turn it all the way up and it just zaps all the high frequency stuff. You definitely want those high frequencies. With an acoustic guitar, the more frequencies that you have to work with, the better, and so you want a material that's going to transmit all those frequencies really well. Bone really does a very good job of that. There's some other things too in terms of how tightly it is fit. This guitar, this saddle has been specifically fit to this bridge, and so it's a very snug fit, and so there's a lot of really good connectivity there to transfer that energy. But the other thing that I do here, especially with classical guitars, is to do intonation work specifically for the guitar, for the setup, and for the set of strings that are on the guitar. So the set of strings that I have on this guitar, and actually, while I'm thinking about it, I'm going to go ahead and snip these ends, because I just realized that I forgot to trim those before I shot this vid. So just give me a second. Because these string ends can kind of cause some rattling, and I don't want that to interfere with what you hear on the end on your end. These are just some standard nippers that I have ground a little bit more flush than normal on this side, just so that I can get real close in and snip those strings. But anyway, we're all set here. So what I do when I set one of these classical guitars up is I'll get the nut and the neck and the string height and everything dialed into about where I want it, and then the last thing that I do is I sit there with a tuner and I play the open note, and then I play the octave, and I see how closely those match, and depending on how off or close they are, I'll put a little tiny pencil mark with an extremely razor sharp pencil down here on this saddle, and I'll carve the crown of that saddle in such a way that I can get the string to make contact on that point that I want it to make contact on. Now, the reason that that's important is because intonation is really going to affect the way that your chords sound, and it's really going to affect the way that your instrument sounds when playing relative to other instruments. And so guitars, being an equally tempered instrument, we're working with an equal temperament system that is further kind of screwed up by the fact that we've got string tensions and string height to deal with. But we can get these things to play fairly well in tune all the way up the neck if we get the intonation dialed in pretty close. And this is about the closest that it gets with acoustics. Most of the time when you're getting acoustics set up with intonation, I say most of the time because there are people who do this. Most of the time, there's kind of a pre-prescribed pattern that we will cut into the top of the saddle to kind of get it close in the ballpark as far as intonation. But with this one, I've actually sat and done a lot of painstaking work to get each string about as close as I can get it. Now, it's an acoustic guitar, so the top is going to move. When moisture hits, it's going to swell up, and when it dries out, the top is going to kind of go down. That's going to affect the string tension, which is going to affect the intonation. So no acoustic generally is going to be perfect, which is why we tend not to spend too much time worrying about this. But on classical guitars, I do find that it's worth taking the time to do. The reason that I find that that is the case is because classical guitars already have kind of a problem in that if you ever notice on a modern acoustic guitar how the saddle is kind of slanted, well, that's compensation, and classical guitars tend not to have any of that going on unless they're like modern hybrids or something. Some do, especially like modern hybrids, but most don't. And so they already have kind of a problem with that. And so I want to help these guitars kind of play more in tune, and especially if you're going to take this classical guitar and you're going to go play with like an early music ensemble where somebody's maybe got a gamba or something, it's perfectly tempered to whatever scale it is that they're playing. If you're playing crunchy chords on kind of a badly intonated guitar, it's going to stand out and it's going to sound awful. So anyway, that's been done. Now, those two pieces of bone, if I were carving them for a customer, it'd be about $100. Different people charge different rates for carving bone. I have a feeling, looking at prices around here, that I'm kind of on the lower end of that, and so that's kind of a lot of money to consider, when looking at a used instrument. And the next thing is also kind of an expensive bit, which is the frets. I've done a level crown and polish on this guitar, which normally would be like $160 in terms of time and labor. And it's something that most used guitars need, and it's something that basically all vintage guitars need unless they've also had this work done on them before. And the reason for that is that if you ever looked at a guitar that's been really well loved, you see all those pits on the frets from where the strings have been rubbing against it for decades and decades, or they're little tiny, chips and tings and dents and whatever in the frets from damage that's happened over the years. Well, all that stuff can kind of affect the way that it plays. If the pits are deep enough, you might play it and hear nothing but buzz coming out of one position on one string. If it's like a little ding in the fret, you're rubbing the string over it and here's like this click or this ting as the string travels over that. And, that's not good. That's going to come out when you're playing. So we want better than that. The way that you get that is a level crown and polish. And so what that means is that the frets have been leveled out. So all of these frets have been perfectly leveled out. And so if you were able to, draw, a flat plane across all the tips of those frets, it would be flat. Relief and fall away. It's not actually flat on a healthy neck, but it's going to be a perfect playing surface, so you're not going to be dealing with any of the problems associated with like high or low frets or things like that. The leveling them is only kind of the beginning of the story, though, because if you just level the frets, they have this flat top on them. Now, that flat top, the string may make contact here, or it may make contact here, but where you want it to make contact is where that fret is mathematically, kind of designed to go, which is right in the middle. And so to get that, you actually have to re-sculpt that crown into the top of the fret and re-round it, so there's just a very thin, rounded point that string comes to rest on where it should, ideally. And even that's not the end of the story, because after you've done that, there's typically a lot of file marks and sanding marks and things that can create a lot of grittiness when you're playing, and you'll hear it in the way that the string makes contact with the fret, which is why the next step is always polishing the frets out. And so if you look, these frets and this fretboard are very, very shiny, and that's not just for looks, it's also for playability. You do want those frets to be very smooth on top, so that you're not getting any of that grittiness, and basically all you're hearing is string and your skill when you're playing, which is ideally what you want to be hearing. So all of that is a lot of work, and it's why I charge more for the instruments that I sell here, but it's also stuff that you don't have to worry about when you buy the instrument from me. I've also gone through and I've done a setup on this guitar. A lot of what a setup has to do with is moving the strings relative to the frets. So if you go too low with the strings, they are going to buzz and rattle and do all kinds of unpleasant things, and if you go too high with the strings, it's going to feel awful playing that guitar. And so there's a happy medium, and a lot of what a setup is finding that happy medium for the guitar. I was able to get a really, really nice low setup on this guitar, which means that the neck and everything is just in great condition. On vintage guitars, that's always kind of a toss-up, because the neck angle may not be healthy. There may be some other stuff. I've got other videos on my channel kind of related to what to look for with old vintage guitars. This one's got a nice healthy neck angle, and no structural problems that interfered with it taking a good setup, which is great, because this guitar plays awesomely, and it's no buzzing, no rattling, and we've got great tone, decent volume out of this guitar. I say decent because I'm used to playing steel strings, and so those are always going to be a lot louder than these nylon string guys. So I'm going to go ahead and try to tune this up real quick, and so that I can play a little something on it so you can hear what it sounds like. But I'm also going to try to do a higher quality audio recording of this guitar with a better microphone, so that you can really hear what it sounds like. Because right now you're hearing this through my iPhone microphone. We may not actually get there with this guitar. Again, these strings are very new. I'm not a classical guitar player, and to be honest, I'm not the best guitar player, and so kind of stuck with what you got in terms of the demo here. But go ahead and play the open note, do an octave harmonic, and then play the octave so that you can hear what that sounds like with the intonation. Again, this iPhone really is not the best speaker to be hearing stuff over. Anyway, yeah, so that's the Regal by Fender. I'm going to see if I can get a date on this guy so that I can put that on the reverb ad, and if that reverb ad is still up, you can order this guitar from me, or if you're in Seattle, you could give me a call and maybe come by and play it and see if you like it. I've got a lot of other videos on this channel. Some of them are ads for guitars I'm selling, just because it helps the guitars sell, and this is how I make my money. And then I've also got a lot of like tips and tricks and just luthier craft talk that may be interesting to some players out there and some other luthiers. If you're watching my channel, it's pretty cool. Anyway, this has been Drew Jones of Drew's Guitar Shop in Seattle, Washington. Thank you so much for watching.